If you've ever ridden the London Underground, the chances are you've sat in a Metro-Cammell train, the name stamped in brass beneath the doors, trodden smooth by millions of feet that never once looked down. At its peak, the Washwood Heath works in Birmingham employed 4,500 people and built nearly 100,000 vehicles. London's tube fleet, the Pendolinos, the trains of Hong Kong's MTR. They survived 2 world wars, survived the Blitz, which destroyed their own record office, survived the beaching cuts, the collapse of export markets, an 80s crisis that stripped away 80% of the workforce. They adapted, retooled, and kept the gates open through everything the 20th century threw at them. And then, after 160 years of building the trains that carried a nation, the works went silent. How does that happen? How does a factory that survived all of that simply disappear? Chapter 1. The Coach Builder and the Meadow. The story begins not with a railway, but with a road, and not with Birmingham, but with Reading, a market town on the Bath Road, 50 miles west of London, where in 1793 a boy named Joseph Wright was born into the family of a coach builder. His father William worked the trade, as did his neighbours and his kin, because in the late 18th century the stagecoach was the artery of English commerce, and the men who built them occupied a particular position in the hierarchy of skilled labour, somewhere between carpenter and artist, required to shape timber to tolerances that would hold its speed over rutted turnpikes, to hang a body on leather springs that would absorb the worst of an English road without shaking the teeth from a paying passenger's head. It was precise work, it was physical work, and it bred a certain confidence, the quiet kind, earned by men who could look at a finished coach and know it would outlast the horses that pulled it. Joseph was apprenticed to a London stagecoach builder while still in his teens, and by his mid-20s he understood the trade from timber selection to finished livery. London, in the 1810s and 1820s, was the centre of the coaching world. The great yards at the Bull and Mouth on St. Martin's-le-Grand, the Swan with 2 necks on Lad Lane, the Golden Cross at Charing Cross, where every morning at dawn the coaches departed for Bath, Bristol, Exeter, York, Edinburgh, each one representing a small fortune in timber, ironwork, leather and paint. The coach builders who served these yards were not labourers, they were craftsmen at the top of their trade, and Wright moved through their world with the assurance of a man whose hands could do what his competitors could not. By 1828, he'd set up as a London coach proprietor in his own right, partnering with a man named Powell under the name Wright and Powell. They built well, built reliably, and built to a standard that caught the attention of the one client that mattered most. When Powell left the partnership in 1834, Wright prospered alone, and prospered spectacularly, winning contracts to build carriages for the Royal Mail. His advertisements bore the royal crest, a mark of quality that in the 1830s carried the weight of a government endorsement. In a trade where reputation was everything, Wright's name now stood beside the crown. But Wright was watching the horizon, and on that horizon was something that would render the stagecoach obsolete within a generation. The railway had arrived. The Liverpool and Manchester had opened in 1830. George Stephenson's rocket had proved that a steam locomotive could carry passengers at speeds no horse could match. The London and Birmingham Railway was under construction, 112 miles of track being carved through the English Midlands by 20,000 navvies, connecting the capital to the country's manufacturing heart. And the men building these railways needed carriages, not horse-drawn coaches on springs, but enclosed vehicles mounted on iron wheels that could be drawn behind a locomotive at 30 miles an hour and arrive intact. Wright saw the connection before most of his competitors did. The skills were transferable. The eye for a well-hung body, the understanding of suspension, the ability to marry timber and iron into something that held together under stress, all of it applied. The dimensions were different, the speeds were different, but the underlying craft was the same. You were building a box that carried human beings, and that box had to be strong enough to protect them and comfortable enough to keep them coming back. He began building railway carriages in 1835, and by 1837 he is credited with supplying the first passenger carriages for the London and Birmingham Railway, one of the great trunk lines of the initial railway age. A coach builder from Reading had become a railway manufacturer in 2 years flat. It was a pivot that would have been remarkable enough for one career. But Wright's ambition ran further than London. He needed space, proper space, acres of it, with room for timber yards and ironwork and finishing shops and railway sidings that could carry a completed carriage directly onto the national network. London couldn't provide that. The yards were cramped, the rents were climbing, and there was no railway connection that would let a finished carriage roll straight from the assembly shop onto the main line. But Birmingham could give him everything. In 1845, Joseph Wright leased 6 acres of meadowland in Saltley, a low-lying district between the Grand Union Canal and the newly opened Birmingham and Derby Junction Railway, 2 miles east of Birmingham's city centre. Saltley sat at the junction of 2 transport networks, the 18th century canal system that had made Birmingham an inland port, and the 19th century railway that was making it the hub of the national network. The site was chosen with a craftsman's logic. Timber and steel arrived by water along the canal. Finished carriages departed by rail from sidings, connected directly to the main line. Between the canal and the railway lay open meadow, flat, well-drained, unbuilt, and large enough to accommodate the assembly sheds and fitting shops that a growing carriage works demanded. Wright pegged out his 6 acres, raised his buildings, and set his eldest son, Henry Wright, and his youngest son, Joseph Wright Jr., to run the Saltley works, while he himself remained in London, managing the commercial relationships and winning the contracts that kept the order book full. This was the pattern of mid-Victorian industrial Birmingham. The city they called the City of 1,000 Trades was a place of fragmented, specialised, intensely skilled metalwork. Gunmakers in the gun quarter, jewellers in the jewellery quarter, brass founders and screw cutters and pin makers scattered across Digbeth and Derritend and Aston. Small workshops, family firms, a culture of making that ran so deep it shaped the accent and the architecture. The railway changed the scale of everything. Saltley, within 2 decades of Wright's arrival, became the most concentrated cluster of railway carriage and wagon builders anywhere on earth. By 1870, 5 large works within a 2-kilometre radius, Wright's Metropolitan, the Midland Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, Brown and Marshall's, the Britannia Works on Arden Road, and several smaller firms, together employed more than 3,000 people building everything that ran on or beside a railway line. Carriages for passengers, wagons for freight, brake vans, horse boxes, cattle trucks, ambulance cars, saloons for directors, third-class stock for the masses. All of it built within earshot of the same works hooters, within walking distance of the same terraced streets, within the same few square miles of low-lying Birmingham. The community that grew up around the works owed its shape to one man. Charles Bowyer Adderley, later the first Baron Norton, was the local landowner who had laid out the streets of Saltley in the 1850s, donated land for Adderley Park and the parish church of St Saviour's, and established the neighbourhood as something more than an industrial camp. The terraced houses that lined the streets south of the railway, Alumrock Road, Washwood Heath Road, the grid of red brick 2-up 2-downs that filled every gap between the canal and the works, were built to house the men who worked in the carriage factories, and the pubs and corner shops and chapels that served those streets existed because the factories existed. Saltley was a made place. It had been farmland a generation earlier. The works created it, and the works sustained it, and everyone who lived there understood that relationship without needing it explained. Wright's works grew fast. By 1853, the Saltley factory employed around 800 men, and the London premises had been closed. Production concentrated entirely in Birmingham, where the space and the railway connection made manufacturing practical at a scale London could never match. Henry Wright managed the works floor. Joseph Jr. managed the commercial side. The old man, now in his late 50s, moved between the 2 cities, overseeing an enterprise that had grown from a coach builder's workshop into one of the largest carriage factories in the country in less than a decade. And then, in 1854, Joseph Wright and Sons of Saltley received a contract that placed the firm on the world stage. They were commissioned to build the first 12 passenger carriages for the Sydney to Parramatta Railway in New South Wales, the first public railway in Australia, which opened in 1855. Those carriages were designed at Saltley, built at Saltley, crated at Saltley, loaded onto a ship at a British port, and carried 17,000 miles to the other side of the world to inaugurate a railway system that would eventually bind a continent together. 3 of those original 12 carriages survive today, preserved at the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, the oldest surviving railway vehicles built in Birmingham, and the physical proof that a 6-acre meadow in the English Midlands was, by the mid-1850s, building the transport infrastructure of nations that didn't yet fully exist. Wright did not live to see how far his legacy would travel. In 1859, Joseph Wright died at the age of 66. What happened next tells you everything about what the works meant to Saltley and what Saltley meant to the works. More than 500 of his men, joiners, fitters, painters, trimmers, labourers, apprentices, formed a procession from the factory gates to the parish church for a special memorial service. The works closed for the day. Nobody ordered it. Nobody had to. The Birmingham press recorded that the name of Mr. Joseph Wright will forever be honourably associated with the trading annals of this town. It was a send-off that a duke might have envied, given not by obligation, but by the kind of loyalty that a fair employer earned in the mid-19th century. When a wage was a fragile thing, a winter without work could mean the poorhouse, and a man who paid his people fairly and treated them as craftsmen rather than expendable hands was remembered with a depth of feeling that the modern employment contract can barely imagine. His sons carried the business forward. In March 1862, the firm was formally registered as a limited company with capital of £100,000, and in 1863 it was reconstituted as the Metropolitan Railway Carriage and Wagon Company Limited, successors to Messrs. Joseph Wright and Sons. The capital was doubled to £200,000 in 1864, then doubled again in the decades that followed, a mark of confidence in a business that was riding the greatest infrastructure boom in human history. The railways were eating the world. Every colony needed track, every track needed rolling stock, and the men at Saltley could build anything that ran on rails. In 1870, the family repurchased outright the original Old Works site, which had been held on lease since Wright's first meadow deal of 1845. By 1900, the Saltley works covered roughly 50 acres, the largest carriage works in the United Kingdom, built on land that 55 years earlier had been 6 acres of grass beside a canal. Joseph Wright never heard the name Metro-Cammell. He never saw a tank, a tube train, or a Pendolino. But every one of those machines traces its bloodline back to his decision, in 1845, to lease a meadow in Saltley and bet his career on the proposition that a coach builder could become a railway manufacturer. And every one of the 4,500 workers who would one day clock in through the gates at Washwood Heath inherited, whether they knew it or not, the craft tradition of a Reading-born coach builder who understood that the skills which built a stagecoach could build a railway carriage, and that the railway carriage could build a world. Chapter 2. Steel, Ships, and the Logic of Scale. While Joseph Wright's sons were expanding the Saltley Works into the largest carriage factory in the country, 2 other stories were unfolding elsewhere, one in Sheffield, one on the Mersey, that would, within half a century, converge with the Metropolitan Works to create the company the world would know as Metro-Cammell. The first belongs to Charles Cammell. Born in 1810 in Kingston upon Hull, the 4th son of George Cammell, Charles started his working life not in a forge, but behind a counter, a commercial traveller for the Ibbotson brothers, a Sheffield cutlery firm. It was an apprenticeship in salesmanship rather than steel-making, but it taught him 2 things that would prove more valuable than metallurgy: how to read a market and how to spot the moment when demand was about to shift. Sheffield in the 1830s was a city of small masters, grinders, cutlers, file makers, men who worked in cramped workshops with a handful of employees, serving a domestic market that was growing but not transforming. Cammell wanted transformation. By 1837, he had saved enough and learned enough to set up his own business on Furnival Street in Sheffield with 2 partners, Thomas Johnson and Henry Johnson. The firm made files and tools, unglamorous products, essential ones, sold into every workshop in the manufacturing Midlands. But Cammell was watching the same horizon Joseph Wright had watched a decade earlier. The railway was coming, and the railway didn't just need carriages. It needed rails. It needed axles, springs, tyres, wheels, the heavy iron and steel components that wore out under the constant punishment of a locomotive's weight and had to be replaced in quantities that no small Sheffield workshop could supply. Cammell intended to be the man who supplied them. In 1845, the same year Wright leased his Saltley meadow, Cammell opened the Cyclops Works on Savile Street in Sheffield. The name was deliberate, the one-eyed giant of Greek myth, a forger of thunderbolts, and Cammell intended his works to be a forge on a scale Sheffield had not yet imagined. Within a decade, the Cyclops Works was rolling iron rails, pressing axles, and manufacturing the tyres and springs that held railway wheels to railway track across the expanding network. The firm rode the Victorian railway boom with the confidence of a man who had placed his bet early and placed it right. In 1864, the business was incorporated as Charles Cammell and Company Limited, with Cammell as chairman and a Glasgow-trained engineer named George Wilson as managing director, a role Wilson would hold for more than 20 years until 1885, providing the technical backbone that Cammell's commercial instinct required. Cammell himself accumulated the estates that marked a Victorian industrialist's ascent: Norton Hall in Sheffield, a country house at Hathersage in the Peak District, Ditcham Park in Hampshire. The progression from commercial traveller on Furnivall Street to country seat in Hampshire, achieved in a single working lifetime. He died in 1879 at 69, respected, wealthy, and presiding over one of the largest steel and engineering firms in the north of England. The second story runs parallel and begins on water. William Laird was a Scottish engineer, born in 1780 in Greenock on the Clyde, who moved south to Liverpool in 1810 and in 1824 bought a tract of land on the south bank of Wallasey Pool in Birkenhead. He founded the Birkenhead Iron Works, initially building boilers, heavy, functional, profitable, unglamorous. But his son, John Laird, born in 1805 and originally articled to a solicitor's clerk, saw something his father hadn't quite grasped: boilerplate techniques, the riveting, a cutting and bending of iron plate into pressure-bearing structures, could be applied to an entirely different product. Not cylindrical vessels that held steam, hollow vessels that held water out, iron ships. John Laird joined his father's business in 1828 and within a decade had transformed the Birkenhead Iron Works from a boiler shop into one of the most advanced shipyards in Britain. By 1839, Laird Brothers, as the firm became after William's death in 1841, was building the East India Company's iron flotilla, including the warships Nemesis and Phlegethon, vessels that would play decisive roles in the First Opium War against China. These were among the world's first iron warships, and Laird built them on the Mersey, with techniques that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. In 1845, the Admiralty commissioned a 1,400-ton iron frigate, HMS Birkenhead, the ship whose catastrophic loss off the South African coast in 1852, with the soldiers standing to attention on the sinking deck while women and children were lowered into the lifeboats, gave the English language the phrase, "women and children first." The name Laird on the Mersey carried the same weight as the name Wright at Saltley, the founding generation, the men who had made something from nothing and stamped their name on it. John Laird retired in 1861 to become Birkenhead's first Member of Parliament. His three sons, William, John and Henry, continued the yard, and it was their firm that in 1902 merged with Cammell's Sheffield Empire in the great rationalisation wave that reshaped British heavy industry at the turn of the century. The rolling stock industry was consolidating at the same time. Small firms couldn't carry the capital costs of modern production: the expensive jigs, the larger cranes, the heavier plate, the longer assembly bays that 20th century rolling stock demanded. The Saltley Works, by now capitalised at £1.5 million, absorbed 5 other firms in a single transaction to become the Metropolitan Amalgamated Railway Carriage and Wagon Company Limited. The swallowed firms read like a roll call of Victorian enterprise: Ashbury Railway Carriage and Iron Company of Manchester, founded by John Ashbury, which had built the carriages for the first underground railway in the world, the Metropolitan Railway of 1863, Brown, Marshalls and Company of Saltley, Wright's neighbour and oldest competitor, specialists in heavy goods wagons, the Lancaster Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, the Oldbury Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, and the Willingsworth Iron Company. 6 firms became one, and the combined entity controlled more assembly bay capacity, more skilled labour, and more railway siding access than any rolling stock builder in the country. In the same year, across the Pennines, Cammell's Steelworks and Laird's Shipyard were joined as Cammell, Laird and Company. The Royal Navy preferred a single corporate jurisdiction for armoured warship contracts, and the combination of Sheffield Steel with Birkenhead Shipbuilding created an entity that could offer the Admiralty everything from armour plate to a finished battleship under one name. Now the pieces were in place for the building that would define everything that followed. In 1907, Cammell Laird purchased a freehold 51-acre site at Washwood Heath, 2 miles further out from Birmingham centre than the original Saltley works, on land adjacent to the Midland Railway's main line to Derby. The existing Saltley factory, for all its expansion since Wright's day, couldn't accommodate the heavier rolling stock that modern railways demanded. Longer coaches, steel-framed rather than timber-framed, requiring higher ceilings, wider bays, heavier cranes. Washwood Heath could. Construction began in 1909 and was completed in 1912. An enormous complex of steel-framed assembly bays, the main bays designated F1 through F4, each one long enough to hold multiple carriage bodies end to end, with high windowed roofs that flooded the shop floor with natural light, machine shops, paint shops, sawmills, drawing offices, and its own internal railway sidings running directly off the main line, the whole of it enclosed behind brick walls and stretching across 51 acres of what had 5 years earlier been open Warwickshire farmland. The Midland Works at Washwood Heath, the building that would become the most productive railway carriage factory in the British Empire, the building where, 91 years after its completion, a French conglomerate would announce the end of train production in Birmingham. And the building that today is nothing, demolished in early 2019, its foundations buried beneath concrete footings for a maintenance depot that will service trains designed in France and Japan. But in 1912, none of that could be imagined. The Midland Works was new, vast, and humming with purpose. What came next would test the men who worked there in ways nobody had anticipated. Chapter 3. The Arsenal. 2 years after the Midland Works at Washwood Heath was completed, the world went to war, and the men who built railway carriages discovered that the skills which shaped a coach body could shape something altogether more lethal. The tank, the armoured fighting vehicle that would transform the Western Front, was developed in secrecy during 1915 and early 1916, driven by the desperate need to cross the killing ground of no man's land under machine gun fire. The prototype, nicknamed Mother, was built by William Foster and Company of Lincoln, a small agricultural engineering firm with a talent for heavy metalwork. But Foster's couldn't produce tanks at the volume the War Office demanded. They needed a partner, a firm with the assembly bay capacity, the heavy metalworking skills, the overhead crane infrastructure, and the railway siding access to manufacture armoured vehicles by the hundred. The Metropolitan Carriage, Wagon and Finance Company of Saltley had all of it. The logic was irresistible. Tank construction was, in essence, the assembly of riveted steel plate into a self-contained vehicle with its own power plant, mounted on tracks rather than wheels. Everything about a carriage works: the jigs, the riveting crews, the cranes, the paint shops, the assembly bays, the sidings for dispatch, applied directly. Initial Mark I orders were split between Foster's and Metropolitan, but from the Mark IV onwards, Metropolitan became the dominant builder, and the scale of what followed deserves to be stated plainly, because it has been largely forgotten outside the specialist literature. Of the 1,220 Mark IV tanks produced between March 1917 and October 1918, 820 were built by Metropolitan, 2 out of every 3. Production used the old park site at Wednesbury, run by the company's patent shaft and axletree subsidiary, and the Oldbury Carriage and Wagon Works. The tanks were assembled from steel plate in the same bays that had, months earlier, held railway wagon frames. The same overhead cranes that lifted a carriage body onto its underframe now lowered armoured hull sections into assembly jigs on the factory floor. The same riveters who had sealed the joints of a first-class dining car now drove rivets through armour plate on a machine designed to cross shell-crated ground under direct fire. Then came the Mark V, the most refined heavy tank design of the First World War, and the first fitted with Wilson's epicyclic steering system, which allowed a single driver to control direction and speed, rather than requiring the exhausting coordination of a 4-man gearing crew. Every single Mark V tank ever built was built by Metropolitan, all 400 of them. The first was driven out through the Birmingham factory gates on the 18th of January 1918, and within months the machines were in action on the Western Front. At Hamel in July, at Amiens in August, along the Hindenburg line in September and October, each advance carrying the weight of a Birmingham factory inside its riveted hull. 579 Mark V tanks a lengthened variant designed to carry infantry or supplies across the battlefield, followed from the same lines. A further development, the Mark V double asterisk, was being assembled at Saltley when the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. Only 25 of 900 ordered were completed. The rest were cancelled overnight, and the bays went quiet. Consider those numbers. 1 company, 2 satellite sites, every Mark V, the majority of Mark IVs, the majority of Mark Vs, the heavy tanks that broke the Hindenburg Line, that crossed the Canal du Nord, that rolled through the shattered villages of Picardy and Flanders in the final months of the war, built overwhelmingly by the men of Saltley, Wednesbury and Oldbury. This was not a peripheral contribution to the war effort. This was the industrial spine of the tank war, and the men who made those tanks went back to building railway carriages when it was over, because the skills were the same skills and the bays were the same bays. The difference was that their work now had blood on it, and they carried that knowledge into the peacetime years without ever quite shaking it loose. After the armistice, the corporate architecture grew more complex. In 1917, Metropolitan and Vickers Limited had jointly acquired control of British Westinghouse, the forerunner of Metropolitan Vickers, the great electrical engineering company that Vickers absorbed fully in 1919. Through the 1920s, the holding companies consolidated and rearranged. Vickers, Cammell Laird, the Patent Shaft, the Leeds Forge, the Metropolitan Carriage Works, all linked by cross-shareholdings, interlocking boards, and the shared logic of an industry that needed scale to survive the coming contraction. The 1920s were hard on the carriage builders. The post-war freight slump cut deep. The 1926 general strike froze production for weeks. Road transport, the lorry, the motorbus, the private car was stealing traffic from the railways at a rate that made the order books of the 1870s look like relics of an extinct world. Through it all, the Metropolitan Works kept going, turning out tramcars for British cities, bus bodies for the growing motorbus market, and the long roll call of imperial export contracts that sustained British rolling stock builders through a decade of shrinking domestic demand. South Africa, Egypt, India, the Argentine, Nyasaland, Jamaica. If it had a railway and flew a British flag, the chances were good that Metropolitan had built something that ran on it. The company had also built horse-drawn and steam trams since the 1860s, and the transition to electric tramcars gave the works a domestic order book that partly compensated for the collapse of mainline railway carriage demand. The bus body work was newer, born of the same road transport revolution that was killing the railways, and it provided the germ of what would eventually become Metro-Cammell Weyman, a separate bus-building subsidiary that survived long after the parent company's name was extinguished. But the industry couldn't sustain the number of firms competing for a shrinking pool of orders. Rationalisation was coming, and when it came, it produced the most important name in British train building. In 1928, the deal was announced. Vickers contributed the Metropolitan Carriage, Wagon and Finance Company, the Patent Shaft and Axletree Company at Wednesbury, and the Willingsworth Iron Company. Cammell Laird contributed its Nottingham factory, the former National Ordnance site it had operated during the war, the Midland Railway Carriage and Wagon Company at Washwood Heath, and the Leeds Forge Company of Armley. In 1929, the merged entity was capitalised as the Metropolitan Cammell Carriage, Wagon and Finance Company Limited, with Vickers and Cammell Laird each holding 50%. The head office remained at Saltley. Two of the largest names in British engineering had pooled their rolling stock operations into a single entity with more factory capacity, more railway sidings, more skilled labour and more institutional knowledge than any train builder in the empire. From the first day, workers and customers called it Metro-Cammell, or on the works floor and in the pubs around Saltley Gate, simply Met-Cam. Hard consonants, 2 beats, a name you could shout across a factory bay, or stamp into a brass floor plate and know it would outlast the building it was bolted to. In 1932, the bus body business was hived off into a joint venture with Weyman Motor Bodies called Metro-Cammell Weyman. In 1934, after a capital reorganisation, the rolling stock operation was retitled the Metropolitan Cammell Carriage and Wagon Company Limited. Legal names shifted and resettled. The name that mattered, Metro-Cammell, never changed. It was the name on the gateposts, on the brass works plates, on the letterhead, and eventually on the floor plates of every London Underground carriage the company built. It would survive for 69 years before being extinguished, not by competition, not by failure, but by a French corporate rebranding that treated the name as an inconvenience to be tidied away. Now the two Birmingham factories ran in tandem. Lighter passenger stock, bus frames and tramcars at the original Saltley Old Works, heavier mainline carriages, mineral wagons and, when the time came again, armoured vehicles at the Midland Works, Washwood Heath. Two works, 2 miles apart, fed by the same canal, served by the same main line, employing between them several thousand men in every skill the industry demanded. It was the largest concentration of rolling stock manufacturing capacity in the British Empire, and it bore the name of a company that had existed for less than a decade, built on foundations laid by 3 families in 3 cities across nearly a century. Then the time did come again, and this time the scale was even larger. Between 1939 and 1945, 95% of Metro-Cammell's output was classified as special war production. The works built large numbers of the Valentine infantry tank, the reliable, unglamorous, slow-moving workhorse that carried British armoured forces through the Western Desert campaigns, from the first actions against Rommel's Afrika Korps to the advance through Tunisia. The Valentine was not fast, not glamorous, and not beloved by the men who crewed it. But it worked. It could be maintained in desert conditions, and it was produced in sufficient numbers to keep the armoured divisions moving when nothing else was available. The patent shaft and axletree works at Wednesbury became the principal tank production line, and the sight of Valentine hulls being rolled out of the same gates that had once dispatched railway wagons became, for the workers who witnessed it, one of those wartime images that lodged permanently in the memory. Metro-Cammell was one of 6 manufacturers, alongside Leyland Motors and Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon, that contributed to the Cromwell cruiser tank programme, producing the fast, well-armoured 30-tonner that formed the backbone of British armoured units in Normandy, through the Falaise Gap, across the Seine, and into the drive through northern Europe. They also built the light tank Mark 8. By late 1944, the company's wartime production stood at more than 3,115 tanks manufactured from scratch, and 1,200 more refitted for continued service, alongside aircraft components, tank landing craft, railway wagons for the Ministry of Supply, and munitions of various types. The war reached the factory gates directly during the Birmingham Blitz. The Saltley Record Office took a direct hit, and the fire that followed destroyed many of the 19th century records that traced the firm's history back to Joseph Wright's original meadow. Minute books, specifications, early correspondence, workforce records, photographs from the Victorian and Edwardian decades. A generation of industrial memory was incinerated in a single raid. The surviving material was gathered after the war and donated to Birmingham Central Library, where it now forms the Metro-Cammell collection at the Library of Birmingham. Approximately 100 photograph albums showing the workforce from the 1910s through the 1980s, 100,000 microfiche aperture card engineering drawings, printed specifications, order books, catalogues, and rolling stock plans. It is the single largest archive of any British rolling stock manufacturer, and it exists because enough of the collection was stored away from the Saltley Record Office to survive a German incendiary bomb. When victory in Europe was declared on the 8th of May 1945, Metro-Cammell had been at continuous war production for 6 years. The men who returned to the peacetime factory floor, and the women who had worked the production lines through the war years, and whose contribution, like so much wartime women's labour, was erased from the formal record almost as soon as the fighting stopped, came back to a company that had proved, twice in a single generation, that it could pivot from carriages to combat vehicles and back again without breaking its stride. The skills ran that deep. The institutional knowledge was that layered. The works could be pointed at virtually any engineering task, a first-class sleeping car, a cruiser tank, a tramcar body, an infantry carrier, and it would deliver on time, to specification, in volume. 4 wars' worth of proof now, stretching from the Mark I in 1916 through the Valentines and Cromwells of the Western Desert and Normandy. What nobody standing in those factory bays in the summer of 1945 could have known, could possibly have imagined, was that the next 25 years would be the greatest era in the company's 100-year history. A golden age so productive, so dominant, so deeply woven into the daily life of the nation, that when it ended, the loss would be felt by virtually every person in the country who had ever stepped onto a London Underground train, boarded a regional diesel multiple unit, caught a morning commuter service, or taken the express on the West Coast Main Line. That golden age was about to begin, and its heart would be Washwood Heath. Chapter 4. The Works Floor. In the years after 1945, a young man arriving at the Washwood Heath gates for his first shift would have experienced the works as a kind of assault on the senses, deliberate, overwhelming, and strangely exhilarating. You'd see it before you reached it. Walking up Lee Road from the Washwood Heath Road end, the Midland Works announced itself through sheer mass, a wall of brick and steel that stretched along the railway line for what felt like half a mile, broken at intervals by the arched entrances where the internal sidings ran through to the main line beyond. The works hooter had already sounded, that long, low blast that could be heard across Saltley, Ward End, Hodge Hill, and as far as Erdington on a still morning, and now the men were streaming through the gates, hundreds of them at a time in the minutes before the shift began, caps and overalls, bicycles stacked in the racks by the gatehouse, the clocking-in machine chattering as each man slid his card through and received the small mechanical confirmation that his day and his pay had begun. Through the gates and into the works, and the first thing that hit you was the sound. Not one sound, a layered composite of sounds that had been building since the night shift handed over. The rhythmic crash of the heavy presses in the machine shop, the staccato bark of rivet guns in the assembly bays, the whine of circular saws in the sawmill, cutting timber for interior panelling and window frames, the hiss of compressed air from the pneumatic tools, and underneath it all, a low-frequency hum that came from the building itself. The vibration of hundreds of machines, transmitted through the concrete floor and the steel columns and the riveted roof trusses, a vibration you felt in your feet and your chest before you consciously registered it as sound. Men who worked there for decades said they could feel the building breathing, a living thing powered by electricity and compressed air and human effort that never quite fell silent even between shifts. The Midland Works in its post-war pomp was organised around the great assembly bays, F1, F2, F3, F4, each one a cathedral of steel and glass with overhead travelling cranes that ran the full length of the bay on rails bolted to the roof trusses. The workflow ran roughly east to west, raw steel and timber in at one end, finished vehicles out at the other, with the internal sidings carrying completed carriages and wagons directly onto the Birmingham to Derby main line. A carriage or multiple unit vehicle would progress through the bays in stages. Underframe fabrication, body framing, body panelling, interior fit-out, painting, electrical installation, final testing. Each stage handled by a different gang of men with different skills, different tools, and different union cards. Under the 1955 British Railways Modernisation Plan, the orders flooded in. This was the moment when Britain's railway system was being dragged, reluctantly and expensively, from steam to diesel and electric traction, and the demand for new rolling stock was enormous. Washwood Heath built thousands of all-steel BR Mark I coaches, the standard British Railways passenger carriage of the 1950s and 1960s, with its distinctive curved roof profile and slam doors, the coach that defined rail travel for a generation. The Saltley Old Works, still operational until 1962, concentrated on the first-generation diesel multiple units, 760 DMU vehicles for British Railways, the Class 101, 102, 104, and 111 units, those iconic green-liveried 2- and 3-car suburban sets that ran every branch line and secondary route in the country. If you caught a local train anywhere in Britain between 1957 and 1990, the chances were better than even that you were sitting in a vehicle built at Saltley. The smell of the works was as distinctive as its sound. Machine oil, the sharp, slightly sweet mineral tang that got into everything, into the pores of your skin, into the fibres of your overalls, into the sandwiches in your snap tin if you weren't careful. Hot metal from the welding and cutting that went on continuously in the fabrication shops. The acid bite of flux from the soldering benches. Paint, cellulose and later polyurethane, applied in the paint shops where the ventilation was never quite adequate and the men worked in masks that were never quite effective. Timber, seasoned hardwood for interior panelling, with that warm, resinous smell that was one of the few pleasant olfactory notes in an otherwise industrial atmosphere. And tea. Always tea. From the canteen, from the brew stations at the end of each bay, from the thermos flasks that men brought from home, the universal solvent of British factory life, brewed strong enough to stand a spoon in, consumed in quantities that would alarm a modern nutritionist. A carriage being built at Washwood Heath in 1958 would pass through perhaps a dozen pairs of hands between the cutting of its first steel section and its departure under its own power, or under tow, onto the main line. The steel men cut and formed the underframe members. The welders joined them. The body framers erected the skeleton of the superstructure. Steel pillars, roof hoops, cant rails. The panellers clad the frame in sheet steel, riveted or later welded. The trimmers fitted the interior. Seats, floor coverings, luggage racks, window frames, partitions. The electricians ran the wiring, lighting circuits, heating circuits, and for powered stock, the traction motor connections that turned the vehicle from a box on wheels into a self-propelled machine. The painters applied primer, undercoat, and top coat in the livery, specified by the customer. British Railways green, later blue and grey, or the customer's own colours for export work. And finally, the inspectors, quality control men from the drawing office, would walk the finished vehicle end to end, checking every joint, every connection, every dimension against the general arrangement drawing that had governed the entire build. Each of these trades had its own hierarchy, its own apprenticeship system, its own sense of professional pride. A man who had served his time as a panel beater at Washwood Heath carried that identity for life. It was stamped on his union card, embedded in his hands, and recognised in any engineering works in the Midlands. The skills were transferable. A good sheet metal worker from Metro-Cammell could walk into any coach building, aircraft, or automotive works in Britain and be productive within a day. But the men who stayed at Washwood Heath stayed because the work itself held them. Building a railway carriage was, in its way, a complete act of manufacture. You began with flat steel and sawn timber, and you ended with a vehicle that carried human beings at speed. You could stand on the platform at New Street or Euston and watch your work go past, every day, for decades. Chapter 5. The Families of Washwood Heath. The workforce at Washwood Heath was not a collection of individuals who happened to work in the same building. It was a community, layered, structured, bound by ties of kinship and neighbourhood and shared experience that went far deeper than the employment contract. Employment at the works was generational. Fathers brought sons. Brothers followed brothers. Albert Wayne was apprenticed as a wood machinist in 1951 and served his time in the sawmill, learning to cut and shape the hardwood that went into carriage interiors, a skill that required a feel for the material that couldn't be taught from a manual. Frank Spink worked the setting-out bench where the dimensions from the drawing office were transferred onto full-scale templates that governed every cut, every bend, every joint in a carriage body. Eddie Warner started alongside Spink in the finishing shop around 1944 and rose over the following decades to become sawmill manager at the Midland Works, a position he held until around 1980. A man who had entered the works as a young apprentice during the war and left it, more than 35 years later, as one of the most experienced timbermen in the rolling stock industry. Percy Jones worked alongside Warner and Spink in that same finishing shop in the mid-1940s and 1950s. Norman Handley was a carpenter on the blue Pullman coaches in the late 1950s, the most prestigious carriage job in the works at that time, requiring a standard of interior finish that would not have disgraced a luxury yacht. Then there was Bill Jones. A black country man, Jones had been a prisoner of war and was, by the accounts of men who knew him, the heaviest survivor of his camp, liberated at 6 stone. He came to work at Washwood Heath after the war and became one of those quiet presences in a works whose name was known to everyone, not because of his rank or his output, but because of what he had survived and the dignity with which he carried it. Bill Blackwell served as welfare officer and club secretary, the man who held the social fabric of the works together, organising the sports teams, the annual outings, the retirement presentations, the Christmas events. Edward Cameron was chief of works, the senior manager on the factory floor, answerable to the board but known to every shop steward and charge hand by name. The unions were as much a part of the architecture of the works as the overhead cranes. The assembly bays F1 through F4 were closed. Shop TGWU, the Transport and General Workers Union, whose members did the heavy assembly work of erecting and fitting carriage bodies. The sheet metal workers were organised through the Birmingham and Midland Sheet Metalworkers Society, a craft union with deep roots in the Midlands metalworking trades. The AIEEU, the Amalgamated Engineering and Electrical Union, covered the engineering trades, the fitters, the electricians, the machinists. The TSSA represented the drawing office staff. ASLEF and the NUR covered the test drivers who took completed vehicles out on the main line for acceptance trials. A man's union card was as much a part of his identity as his national insurance number, and the interplay between unions, the demarcation disputes, the wage negotiations, the occasional solidarity actions, was the political heartbeat of the works. The community beyond the gates was shaped by the same rhythms. The streets around Washwood Heath Road and Alum Rock Road, Ward End, Hodge Hill, Saltley, Washwood Heath itself, were working-class neighbourhoods whose economic life was tied to the factories that employed their residents. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the workforce was predominantly white, drawn from the established Birmingham working class, families whose roots in Saltley and Ward End went back to the Victorian expansion. From the late 1960s and through the 1970s, the demographic composition shifted as Saltley became home to large Pakistani, Bangladeshi and Irish communities, and the works reflected that change. The factory floor became one of the most ethnically mixed workplaces in the Midlands, a transition that was not without friction, but that, in the recollection of men who lived through it, was managed with more pragmatism than ideology. You were judged on the works floor by whether you could do the job. The rest was secondary. The Met Sports Ground at Beaufort, known simply as the Beaufort, was the social centre of the works. Sold in 1985 to Wolverhampton and Dudley Brewery, and renamed the Beaufort Club, it hosted the works' football, cricket and bowls teams, the annual sports day, the retirement dinners, the Christmas dances. It was the place where apprentices met their future wives, where retiring men were given their clocks and their handshakes, where the community of the works extended beyond the factory gates into something that resembled, in its way, a village that happened to build trains. And Saltley itself had its own place in the political history of the nation. On 10th February 1972, during the National Miners' Strike, up to 30,000 Birmingham engineers and factory workers, many of them from Metro-Cammell and the nearby factories, walked out in solidarity with the picketing miners at the Saltley Gate Coke Depot, half a mile from the Washwood Heath Works. The mass picket forced the police to close the depot gates, cutting off fuel supplies to the Midlands power stations. Arthur Scargill, then a young Yorkshire NUM official, described it as the moment the working class showed its strength. It was the decisive act of the strike, the moment that broke the Heath government's resistance to the miners' wage demands, and it happened within walking distance of the works that Joseph Wright had founded 127 years earlier. The men who marched to Saltley Gate and stood in the freezing February morning weren't acting as Metro-Cammell employees. They were acting as members of a class, a community, and an industrial culture that saw an attack on one set of workers as an attack on all of them. The men of Metro-Cammell didn't just build trains. They were woven into the industrial and political life of the city in ways that reached far beyond the order book. The women who had worked the production lines during the war years had largely been eased out by 1946 as returning servicemen reclaimed their positions, a pattern replicated across every factory in Britain. By the 1960s, the visible female presence at Washwood Heath was concentrated in the offices, the canteen, and the stores. The works floor remained overwhelmingly male, governed by a culture of physical labour, apprenticeship, and trade union membership that was in practice, if not in principle, a male preserve. In 1962, the original Saltley Old Works, the site where Joseph Wright had leased his 6 acres in 1845, expanded to 50 acres by 1900 and built everything from the first Australian railway carriages to 760 diesel multiple units, was closed. The site that had launched the entire enterprise was shut down, its work transferred to Washwood Heath. In 1964, the old park works at Wednesbury, where the Mark V tanks had been assembled in 1918, followed. In 1967, group administration moved to Lee Road, Washwood Heath. One by one, the satellite sites were closed and their work consolidated into the single factory that now bore the whole weight of the Metro-Cammell name. Now, the whole of Metro-Cammell meant one place, a 51-acre fenced city behind brick walls with its own sidings off the Birmingham Derby line, its assembly bays F1 through F4 stretching under high-glazed roofs, its machine shops and drawing offices and paint shops, its canteen serving breakfast and dinner to each shift, its gatehouse and time office and stores, and the Met Club, the sports and social club on Beaufort Road, where the works bowls team, football team and cricket team trained and played, where retirement dinners were held, where apprentices danced with local girls on Saturday evenings, and where the men who built the trains drank their pints and played their darts and told the stories that held the community together. Washwood Heath was not just a factory, it was for the families who depended on it an entire way of life, a self-contained world with its own rhythms, its own hierarchies, its own loyalties, and its own definition of what it meant to do good work. Chapter 6. A name on every floor plate. By the mid-1960s, Metro-Cammell's dominance of the London Underground fleet was so complete that the company's name had become, for millions of Londoners, the most read manufacturer's plate in Britain, and most of them never noticed it. It was stamped into the brass floor plates fitted beneath the doors of every carriage the company built for London transport. England Metro-Cammell, followed by the year of manufacture, 1959, 1962, 1967, 1972, 1973. Trodden on by millions of feet every day, scuffed and polished smooth by the passage of commuters who stepped over it without a downward glance, that plate was the single, most ubiquitous piece of industrial branding in British public life, and behind it lay a production record that no other rolling stock manufacturer in the country could match. The roll call of London Underground stock built at Washwood Heath reads like a timeline of the tube itself. The 1938 stock, over 1,000 cars built jointly with Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon for the New Works programme, the streamlined Art Deco trains that defined the pre-war Underground and ran, astonishingly, until the 1980s. The 1959 stock for the Piccadilly line, 76 7-car trains, the fleet that carried the line through its busiest decades. The 1962 stock for the Central line. Then, in 1967, something genuinely historic, the 1967 stock for the Victoria line, the world's first regularly automated mainline metro railway, a system where the trains drove themselves using a coded signal embedded in the running rails. The driver, present only to close the doors and press the 2 start buttons simultaneously. Every one of those trains was designed and built at Washwood Heath, and when the Victoria line opened to passengers on March 7th, 1969, it was a Birmingham-built fleet that made it possible. London got the glory. Washwood Heath did the work. The 1972 stock for the Bakerloo and Jubilee lines followed, and then the crown jewel, the 1973 stock for the Piccadilly line, 87.5 trains, ordered in January 1972 in a £39 million contract from the Greater London Council. The trains that would carry the famous England Metro-Cammell 1973 floor plate under millions of shoes for more than 50 years. The 1983 stock, 15 single-leaf door trains for the original Jubilee line, completed the sequence. On any given day in the 1980s, perhaps half of all journeys taken on the London Underground were made in Metro-Cammell trains. Half. The company didn't just supply the tube. For a generation, the company was the tube, or at least the physical fabric of it, the steel shells and bogies and traction motors that carried 800 million passenger journeys a year through tunnels that had been bored a century earlier. No other manufacturer in British history achieved that level of penetration into a single public transport system. But the underground contracts were only part of the story. In 1959 and 1960, the works produced 5 luxury diesel-electric multiple units for British Railways, 2 6-car sets for the Midland Pullman service between London St Pancras and Manchester, and 3 8-car sets for the Western Region's Birmingham, Bristol and South Wales Pullmans. These were the Blue Pullmans, finished in a striking Nanking blue and white livery, fitted with air conditioning, double glazing, leathercloth padded walls, and individual table lamps with steward call buttons at every seat. They were Britain's first high-speed luxury multiple units, years ahead of their time, and their construction was considered significant enough for British transport films to commission a documentary about it. The 1960 film Blue Pullman, directed by James Ritchie with an eerie modernist score by Clifton Parker, followed the trains from assembly at Washwood Heath to their first run on the main line, and won the Technical and Industrial Information section at the 1961 Festival for Films for Television. It captured, in 20 minutes of grainy colour footage, what the works looked like at the peak of its confidence. The clean lines of the finished trains against the industrial backdrop of the bays, the pride of the men who built them visible in the way they handled the finished product. Norman Handley, the Washwood Heath carpenter, worked on the interior woodwork of those Pullman coaches, and the standard of finish he and his colleagues achieved, hand-fitted panels, precision-cut mouldings, surfaces smooth enough to satisfy a furniture maker, was talked about in the works for years afterwards. The Blue Pullman was an operational disappointment, withdrawn in 1973 after persistent mechanical problems, but as a piece of industrial craft, it represented the absolute zenith of what Washwood Heath could produce when given a brief that demanded perfection. And its aesthetic DNA, the clean lines, the multiple unit concept, the ambition to offer airline standard comfort on rails, passed directly into the intercity 125, the train that would later revolutionize British mainline travel. Between 1945 and 1970, the company estimated its total output at nearly 100,000 vehicles of more than 400 different types. The sheer range of that output is itself a measure of what Washwood Heath could do, from a simple mineral wagon, a steel box on wheels built in volume for British Railways freight operations, to a luxury Pullman coach with hand-finished interiors, to a London Underground train with its own traction motors and automatic train operation equipment, to a tropical climate passenger coach for the Nigerian railways, designed to operate in temperatures and humidity levels that would have destroyed a British domestic vehicle within a year. Each order required different drawings, different specifications, different materials, different testing regimes. The drawing office at Washwood Heath, the room where the general arrangement plans were prepared, where every dimension of every vehicle was set down before a single piece of steel was cut, was, in its way, as vital to the operation as the assembly bays themselves. Without the draftsmen, nothing got built. The export order book spanned half the globe: Brazil, Jamaica, Egypt, South Africa, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Mexico, and from 1955 the Kowloon Canton Railway in Hong Kong, each contract adapted to local conditions, local loading gauges, local climate, local operating practices. Metro-Cammell's reputation in the export market rested on a simple proposition. They could build anything you needed to any specification you set, and it would work when it got there. In 1961, owned 50-50 by Cammell Laird and Vickers, the company employed approximately 4,500 people across Washwood Heath, the residual Saltley operations, the Elmdon Works, and Wednesbury. It was described in its own literature as a designer and manufacturer of railway locomotives, carriages, wagons, railcars, and road passenger transport vehicles for worldwide market. 100,000 vehicles, 4,500 workers, a product range that stretched from a mineral wagon to a luxury Pullman to a London Underground train. And a name, Metro-Cammell, that was stamped into the floor of every carriage, bolted to the side of every wagon, embossed on every works plate and specification sheet and letter of credit that left the drawing office at Washwood Heath. It was, by any measure, the peak of British train building, and the men who worked there knew it. Chapter 7. The Second Wind. The home market that had sustained Metro-Cammell's golden age was, by the late 1960s, beginning to contract. British Rail's rationalisation programme, the beaching cuts of 1963 to 1965 that had closed a third of the network's stations and thousands of miles of branch line, and the steady decline in export orders as former colonies developed their own manufacturing capacity. All of it was squeezing an industry that had been built for expansion and was now living in a world of shrinkage. In 1969, the company was renamed Cammell Laird, Metro. In 1970, the Cammell Laird parent group lurched into a financial crisis that forced the government to take a 50% stake in the shipbuilding division at Birkenhead. Through it all, the Washwood Heath Works pivoted from domestic railway supplier to international rapid transit builder, and found, in the other hemisphere, the contract that would sustain it for the next 2 decades. In July 1976, the Mass Transit Railway Corporation of Hong Kong placed an order for 140 cars, the M-train fleet, for the modified initial system. The competition had been fierce. Bids from Australia's Comeng, Belgium's BN and ACEC, Canada's Hawker Siddeley and Bombardier, and Germany's MANSE. Metro-Cammell won on a combination of price, technical capability, and the reputation that the Washwood Heath name carried in the international rapid transit market. And the relationship that followed was, for 20 years, the single most important commercial connection the factory possessed. Between 1977 and 1997, a total of 768 cars were built at Washwood Heath for the Hong Kong MTR, M-Stock in 1978, T-Stock between 1982 and 1985, and G-Stock in 1988 and 1989. Each batch represented an evolution. The T-Stock was air-conditioned, the G-Stock incorporated newer traction technology, but all were built to the same fundamental design philosophy, assembled in the same bays by men whose expertise in rapid transit vehicle construction was now among the deepest in the world. The first MTR train was tested not in Hong Kong, but on the Tyne and Wear Metro test track in England, before being shipped to the Far East, because Metro-Cammell had built that fleet too. In parallel, between 1980 and 1990, the works built 29 12-car electric multiple-unit sets for the Kowloon Canton Railway British section, the ACEMUS, known to Hong Kong commuters as the Yellowhead for their distinctive livery. These were heavy rail trains, not metro cars, designed for the longer distance services between Kowloon and the Chinese border, and they represented a different engineering challenge: higher speeds, longer formations, different signalling systems. Washwood Heath handled both programs simultaneously, the metro cars and the mainline EMUS sharing the same factory floor, the same cranes, and in many cases the same workers. For a decade, Hong Kong was essentially a second home market for Metro-Cammell, a client whose repeat orders kept the bays occupied and the workforce employed at a time when the domestic British order book was thinning to nothing. The Tyne and Wear Metro, opened in stages from 1980, was the first new urban rail system built in Britain since the pre-war era, and the entire fleet was designed and manufactured at Washwood Heath between 1978 and 1981. Meanwhile, the 1973 Piccadilly line stock was still being delivered. The 1972 Mark II Jubilee and Bakerloo stock was in service. The Glasgow subway was modernised with Metro-Cammell cars that bore the company's name into the 2010s, and in 1984 the works produced 3 single carriages for the Birmingham International Maglev, the world's first commercial magnetic levitation passenger transit system, running a 600-metre shuttle between Birmingham International Railway Station and the National Exhibition Centre and Airport Terminal. The carriages floated on electromagnets, riding a guideway rather than rails, at speeds of up to 25 miles per hour, a technological marvel that drew engineering delegations from Japan, Germany and America. It was in commercial service for 11 years before being replaced by a conventional cable-hauled system in 1995. A curiosity perhaps, but it was built at Washwood Heath, and the fact that it existed at all, that the same factory could produce a London Underground train and a magnetic levitation vehicle in the same decade, testified to the extraordinary range of engineering capability that the works still commanded. Then, in April 1984, the blow fell. The Mass Rapid Transit Corporation of Singapore announced that Contract 151, valued at 581.5 million Singapore dollars, for 66 6-car trains, had been awarded to a Japanese consortium led by Kawasaki Heavy Industries, with Nippon Sharyo, Tokyu Car Corporation, and Kinki Sharyo. Metro-Cammell's joint bid with Singapore Automotive Engineering had been beaten on price. Almost simultaneously, the initial Docklands Light Railway order went elsewhere. The two losses together were devastating. The Hong Kong work was winding down. The domestic order book was nearly empty. The pipeline that had sustained the works for a decade had run dry. Almost 80% of the workforce was made redundant. Men who had served 20-year apprenticeships and expected to retire from the works were given their cards and walked out through the same gates their fathers had walked through. By 1985, the only work running through the Washwood Heath bays was 6 battery locomotives and 2 prototype trains for the Central Line, a trickle of work in a factory designed for a flood. The assembly bays that had simultaneously held Hong Kong Metro cars and Tyne and Wear Metro vehicles and Piccadilly Line tube stock were empty. The overhead cranes sat motionless on their rails. The canteen that had served hundreds of hot dinners at midday was catering for a fraction of its capacity. The factory that had employed 4,500 people in 1961, that had built 100,000 vehicles in 25 years, was down to a skeleton crew working on contracts that could have been handled by a workshop, a tenth the size. The company survived, but it survived by changing what it was. Metro-Cammell pivoted from full manufacture to final assembly, sourcing body shells and major components from external suppliers and using the Washwood Heath bays as a finishing and integration facility rather than a cradle-to-grave production line. The body shell, the steel structure of the vehicle, the single most labour-intensive component, would henceforth arrive from elsewhere, prefabricated, ready for interior fit-out, electrical installation and painting. It was a rational response to a market that no longer supported domestic volume production. It kept the gates open. It kept some jobs alive. It allowed the company to bid competitively on contracts where the alternative was to bid not at all. But something had been lost that would never come back. The ability to build a train from raw steel to finished product within a single works, under a single name, with a single workforce that understood every stage of the process, from first weld to final coat of paint. The integrated manufacturer had become an assembler of other people's parts. With hindsight, the mid-1980s was the moment when the soul of Metro-Cammell departed the building. The body carried on. The name still hung above the gates. But the thing that made it what it was, an integrated train manufacturer, one of the last in Britain, was already gone. And the men who had seen the works at its peak, who had built the underground trains and the Blue Pullmans and the Hong Kong M trains with their own hands, knew it. They could feel the absence of something they couldn't quite name. The works was still running, but it wasn't the same works anymore. What came next? The sail, the float, the French takeover, the Pendolino, and the final betrayal would merely complete what the 1984 crisis had begun. Chapter 8. Weinstock's Trade. The man who sold Metro-Cammell to the French believed he was saving it. Lord Arnold Weinstock, managing director of the General Electric Company, the most powerful industrialist in post-war Britain, the man who had assembled a conglomerate spanning defence electronics, telecommunications, power generation and traction engineering through 3 decades of patient, calculating acquisition, understood by the late 1980s that the European rolling stock industry was entering an era of consolidation from which there would be no escape. The old pattern of national markets served by national builders was ending. The European community was opening procurement. The French, the Germans, the Swedes, the Italians, all of them were merging their train builders into multinational groups that could compete for contracts anywhere on the continent. The British, with their fragmented, underfunded post-privatisation railway supply chain, were being left behind. Weinstock could count the British players on one hand. GEC Traction in Manchester built the electrical systems. Brel, British Rail Engineering Limited, had been privatised and broken up. Metro-Cammell at Washwood Heath was the last significant carriage builder with international rapid transit credentials, and it was already weakened by the 1984 crisis that had stripped away 80% of its workforce. The French had the TG Fee and the company that built it, Alstom, the rolling stock and power generation arm of the Compagnie Générale d'Électricité. The Germans were consolidating into what would become Siemens Transportation and the consortium that produced the ICE. Against these emerging giants, a single Birmingham factory, however storied, could not compete alone for the large international contracts that would define the next generation of railway building. The logic pointed in one direction: scale, and scale meant partnership. In early 1989, Weinstock and Jean-Pierre Desgeorges of CGE agreed to form GEC Alstom, a 50-50 joint venture between the British General Electric Company and the French Alstom. The logic was European scale. The French brought the TGV technology and the manufacturing base at La Rochelle, Belfort and Valenciennes. GEC brought traction engineering, signalling and, critically, Metro-Cammell, the last major British train builder with international rapid transit credentials. Modern railways described the deal as creating a multinational able to match similar mergers then taking place across the European engineering landscape. Weinstock, according to those who knew his thinking, believed that embedding British train building inside a Franco-British structure was the only way to give it access to the European market. Go it alone, and you withered. Join the French, and you had a future. In May 1989, GEC Alstom acquired Metro-Cammell from the Laird Group. The brand was kept, for a time. Washwood Heath traded as Metro-Cammell, a GEC Alstom Group company, and the nameplate on the factory gates still read Metro-Cammell. Weinstock, described in modern railways as the man who kept the French honest, remained as managing director of GEC, and while he was there, the British half of the joint venture retained its weight. The French might have had the TGV, but Weinstock had the leverage that came from controlling 50% of the shares and knowing how to use it. Under GEC Alstom ownership, Washwood Heath remained productive, but the nature of the productivity was changing in ways that mattered more than the order book suggested. The factory fitted out all 38 buffet cars for the British Rail Class 373 Eurostar. The power cars were built at Belfort in eastern France. The trailer cars principally at La Brugeoise et Nivelles in Bruges and at Alstom's works at Aitré near La Rochelle, but the buffet car interiors and some intermediate trailer fitting out were done at Washwood Heath, with the first vehicles arriving by train ferry to Dover in 1991. Eurostar services began on 14 November 1994. The works also built Class 465 and 466 Networker EMUs for Network South East between 1991 and 1994, Class 156 Super Sprinter DM-US BR Mark IV coaches for the East Coast Main Line, 7 4-car units for the Stockholm-Arlanda Express, and, continuing the Hong Kong relationship that had sustained the factory since 1976, the H-Stock for the MTR, built as components in Birmingham and finally assembled at Kowloon Bay Depot between 1994 and 1998. There was even a contract for night stock sleeper trains intended for Channel Tunnel services, though only half were completed and the trains were never run, an ominous omen of the procurement dysfunction that would plague Alstom's UK operations in the years ahead. The order book looked healthy, the work was real, but underneath the visible productivity, a structural transformation was underway that would prove fatal. The most revealing contract of the GEC Alstom period was the London Underground Northern Line, PFI, a £700 million deal won in December 1994 to design, build, finance and maintain 106 6-car trains for at least 20 years. A £400 million subcontract followed in April 1995. London Underground would pay only for trains that were available and reliable, a radical departure from traditional procurement, and one that placed the financial risk squarely on the manufacturer. The 1995 stock was assembled at Washwood Heath between 1996 and 2000. But the body shells, the steel structures of the trains themselves, the single most labour-intensive and skill-intensive component of a railway vehicle, were not built at Washwood Heath. They were manufactured at Alstom's factory at Barcelona, on the Spanish seafront, shipped to Birmingham, and fitted out in the Washwood Heath bays. The very similar 1996 stock for the Jubilee line, 59 6-car trains, followed the identical pattern. Spanish body shells, Birmingham finishing, French management, British public money. This was the moment when the factory ceased to be a true train builder and became what the industry calls an assembly and integration facility. The body shell is the heart of a railway vehicle. When you build the body shell, you control the manufacturing process. When you import it, you are a finisher. A skilled finisher, certainly, employing real people with real expertise, but a finisher nonetheless. The decision to source body shells from Barcelona was not taken at Washwood Heath. It was taken within the GEC Alstom structure, and it was taken because the Barcelona factory needed work and could produce body shells more cheaply than Birmingham. The logic was corporate. The consequence was industrial. The deepest layer of train building skill, the ability to take flat steel plate and turn it into a vehicle structure, was being extracted from Washwood Heath and relocated to Spain, and it would never come back. The men on the works floor understood what was happening even if the language to describe it was corporate and opaque. They could see the Spanish body shells arriving on the sidings. They could see that the work they were doing, fitting interiors, running cables, installing traction equipment, testing systems, applying paint, was finishing work, not building work. The hollowing out that had begun with the 1984 crisis was now, under GEC Alstom ownership, becoming the permanent architecture of the operation. And the men in the bays knew, with the instinct that comes from a lifetime in manufacturing, that a factory which cannot build its own core product is a factory waiting to be closed. Chapter 9. The Name They Killed. In June 1996, Lord Weinstock retired as managing director of GEC. He was 72. He had run the company for 33 years, building it from a medium-sized electrical manufacturer into Britain's largest industrial conglomerate, a company that at its peak employed over 100,000 people and held dominant positions in defence electronics, telecommunications, power generation, and transport engineering. His replacement was George Simpson, a Scottish-born accountant and career manager who had previously run Rover Group and Lucas Industries. Simpson's vision for GEC was radically different from Weinstock's, where Weinstock had believed in manufacturing, in making things, in owning factories, in the patient accumulation of industrial capability over decades. Simpson believed in the new economy, telecommunications, the internet, the asset-light, high-margin businesses that the late 1990s stock market rewarded with soaring valuations. Manufacturing was yesterday. The future was digital. Simpson's restructuring of GEC was swift and, in retrospect, catastrophic. The company was renamed Marconi, the defence businesses were sold to British Aerospace, and the industrial holdings, including GEC's 50% stake in the joint venture with Alstom, were disposed of to fund a disastrous pivot into telecommunications equipment. The dot-com bubble would burst in 2001, destroying Marconi's share price and effectively ending the company. But by then, the damage to British train building had already been done. GEC sold its 50% share of the joint venture in a flotation on the 22nd of June 1998, simultaneously on the Paris, London and New York stock exchanges. The company that emerged was no longer a joint venture. It was no longer half British. It was a French-controlled, publicly quoted corporation, headquartered in Paris. Per its own 1998/99 annual report, Alstom began the year as a 50-50 joint venture company and became a fully independent, publicly quoted company, renamed Alstom at the time of our flotation. The centre of gravity, of decision-making, of investment, of strategic priority, shifted overnight from a balance between London and Paris to Paris alone. The French factories at La Rochelle, Belfort, Valenciennes, and Savigliano in Italy were now the home plants. The British operations at Washwood Heath, Preston and Wolverton were branch factories of a foreign multinational, subject to decisions taken in a boardroom where no one present had ever walked through the Washwood Heath gates. At the factory itself, the change was felt first in the name. The words Metro-Cammell came off the gateposts. The works became the Alstom UK Assembly Facility. After 69 years, since the 1929 merger that had united the Metropolitan and Cammell-Laird interests, the name that had been stamped on tube floor plates, embossed on work specifications, printed on wage slips, and spoken by 4 generations of Birmingham workers, was retired. To the corporate planners in Paris, it was a brand rationalisation. One name, one identity, one global brand. To the men who had spent their working lives under that name, who had told people they worked at Metro-Cammell the way a soldier tells people he served in a regiment, it was something else entirely. An erasure. The moment when the building stopped being theirs and became someone else's property, operating under someone else's flag, serving someone else's priorities. What Weinstock had feared, and what his continued presence at GEC had prevented for 7 years, was now happening without restraint. The joint venture that was meant to give British train building a route into Europe had been converted, through a stock market flotation driven by a man who wanted to get out of manufacturing altogether, into a vehicle for absorbing British industrial capacity into a French corporate structure. The French factories continued to build trains. The British factory continued to assemble them. The distinction was structural, permanent, and, as events would prove within 5 years, fatal. But the works was not yet dead, because into this hollowed-out shell came the largest single order in its history. In 1997, Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Trains won the Intercity West Coast franchise. In 1999 and 2000, Virgin placed orders, valued by Alstom at €1.8 billion, for 53 9-car tilting trains based on the Italian Pendolino concept, developed by Fiat Ferroviaria, in which Alstom acquired a 51% stake in 2000. The body shells and bogies came from Fiat's works at Savigliano in northern Italy. Final assembly was contracted to Washwood Heath, the Class 390 Pendolino, the train that every viewer of this documentary has seen and most have sat in. Capable of 8 degrees of active tilt, the carriage body leaning into curves like a motorcycle, compensating for the centrifugal force that would otherwise make passengers spill their coffee. With a top speed of 140 miles per hour, limited to 125 in service, these were the trains that took the Glasgow to London journey time under 4 hours for the first time. 53 of them, each one a 9-car articulated set weighing over 450 tons, assembled in the Washwood Heath bays, Italian body shells from Savigliano, lifted onto Italian bogies by the same overhead cranes that had once lifted the body shells of Hong Kong metro cars and London Underground trains. It was the largest single rolling stock contract ever assembled at Washwood Heath, and it produced the train that defines British mainline travel in the 21st century. The last great act of manufacture at Washwood Heath, except that it was assembly, not manufacture, Italian design, Italian body shells, Italian bogies, French ownership, Birmingham finishing. The distinction, once again, mattered. Around this triumph, the rest of Alstom's UK railway business was falling apart. The company's Juniper family of electric multiple units, Class 334 for ScotRail, Class 458 for South West Trains, Class 460 for Gatwick Express, had been plagued by reliability problems and delayed safety approvals that damaged Alstom's reputation with every train operating company in Britain. The Carradia diesel multiple units were no better. The Class 175 for First North Western and the Class 180 Adelante for First Great Western suffered similar problems, earning the Alstom name a reputation for promising more than it could deliver. The irony was savage. Metro-Cammell had spent decades building a reputation for quality and reliability. The Hong Kong MTR contract had been won partly on the strength of that reputation, and the Alstom-branded products that replaced it were systematically destroying it. From 2001 onwards, no further UK rolling stock orders were won. The pipeline that should have sustained Washwood Heath beyond the Pendolino programme was empty, and the reason it was empty was that the Alstom name in Britain had become associated with late delivery and poor reliability. The brand that replaced Metro-Cammell had failed on the terms that Metro-Cammell had defined, and the parent company was in crisis. Alstom Group's industrial gas turbine business, acquired from ABB in 1999 at the height of the energy deregulation boom, had generated catastrophic accounting write-downs as the contracts it inherited proved far more costly to service than the purchase price assumed. The share price collapsed from over €30 to under €2. Debt spiraled. Credit agencies downgraded the company's bonds. By late 2002, there was genuine doubt in the financial press about whether Alstom would survive as an independent entity. In November 2002, the board appointed Patrick Krohn as chief executive. Krohn was the son of Polish-Jewish Holocaust survivors, an École Polytechnique graduate, a product of the French industrial elite, a man who had run the industrial minerals company Imerys, and understood, with the clarity of an engineer trained in the Grande École, that restructuring meant closing what could not be saved in order to preserve what could. His mandate was brutal and unambiguous: cut costs, close factories, sell non-core businesses, and keep Alstom alive long enough for the French government to mount a rescue. On March 11, 2003, Krohn took the chairmanship as well, replacing the outgoing Pierre Bilger, the man who had presided over the acquisitions that created the crisis. The same day, Krohn announced a company-wide reorganisation. 3 days later, on 14th March, the transport sector received a new president, Philippe Méliès, brought in from Renault Trucks and Volvo, replacing Michel Moreau. Méliès's task was to rationalise Alstom Transport's global factory network, which meant deciding which plants would stay open and which would close. In Birmingham, Paul Barron had been vice president of Alstom Transport UK since 2000. He was the man the Washwood Heath workforce knew by name, the man they saw in the corridors, the man who would deliver the news that the Paris restructuring had generated. Chapter 10. The 20th of June. On Friday, June 20th, 2003, Alstom announced that no further new build work would be carried out at the Washwood Heath site after completion of the 53 Pendolino sets, expected in July or August of 2004. 1,400 jobs were on notice. The announcement came at a moment of exquisite hypocrisy. Alstom was simultaneously holding a fresh £101 million contract from London Underground for 87 additional Jubilee line carriages, 59 trailer cars to extend existing trains, plus 4 new 7-car sets. This was British public money, committed by a British public transport authority for trains that would run exclusively on a British Underground railway, serving British passengers. Every pound of it came from UK taxpayers and fare payers. When the work was actually carried out between 2003 and 2005, every single one of those vehicles was built at Alstom's new factory at Santa Perpetua de Mogoda in the Barcelona suburbs, a facility that the company had opened specifically to handle the growing volume of Spanish and international orders that its continental strategy demanded. Not one carriage was built at Washwood Heath. The factory that could have built them, that had built every generation of Jubilee line stock from the 1972 Mark II onwards, was being closed at the same time as the contract was being fulfilled in Spain. UK taxpayer money flowing through London Underground, paying Spanish workers to build trains for a British railway, while the British workers who had built the previous generation of those same trains were being given their redundancy notices. The facts alone carry the weight of the indictment. The political response was immediate. Terry Davis, the Labour MP for Birmingham Hodge Hill, the constituency that contained Washwood Heath, tabled a written parliamentary question to the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, asking how often she had met Paul Barron to discuss the future of the factory. On July 7, 2003, Davis tabled Early Day Motion 22,612, which attracted 76 signatures from across the main parties. Its text is the single clearest contemporary statement of what had been done. The motion noted that soon after securing a £101 million order to supply rolling stock for the London Underground, the French-owned multinational Alstom announced that it had decided to cease production at its plant at Washwood Heath, Birmingham, thereby bringing to an end 150 years of train production at the plant and threatening 1,400 jobs. It stated the belief that if there had been a major order for Alstom-produced rolling stock by the French railways, then it is unlikely that it would have been regarded as acceptable for Alstom to either reduce its investment in France or produce the rolling stock outside that country. And it called on Alstom to recognise its obligations to all the communities on which it has relied for its manufacturing base. 76 members of Parliament signed that motion. It made no difference. The parallel scandal was the rescue of Alstom itself. In 2003 and 2004, the company secured a bailout worth exactly €2.5 billion, with the European Commission approving the rescue plan on the 22nd of September 2003. The French state took a 21% stake in Alstom for €772 million. Consider what this meant. A French company, building trains with British public money in Spanish factories, was being rescued by the French government as a strategic national asset, an enterprise too important to French industry and French employment to be allowed to fail. That same company was simultaneously closing its British factory, the oldest and most productive train building site in the country, and transferring its British contracts to factories in France and Spain. The rescue preserved French jobs, the closure destroyed British ones. The asymmetry was not subtle, not hidden, and not accidental. It was the logical outcome of a corporate structure in which the centre of gravity was in Paris and the periphery was in Birmingham. The Early Day Motion stated it explicitly. If Alstom had received a major order from the French National Railways, SNCF, it would have been unthinkable for the company to build those trains outside France. Unthinkable. The word carries the weight of the argument. French industrial policy protected French manufacturing jobs as a matter of course, a matter of national self-respect, a matter that no French politician of any party would have dared to challenge. British industrial policy did not extend the same protection to British manufacturing jobs. The EDM asked why not. The answer, as delivered by events, was that nobody in a position of authority thought the question worth answering. Tom Keogh, the Amicus Union regional spokesman in the West Midlands, demanded an urgent meeting with the government and argued publicly that the job losses were unnecessary. that Britain would need to replace 40% of its rolling stock over the next few years, meaning work should have been plentiful at Washwood Heath for a decade to come. The TGW, whose new General Secretary Tony Woodley had taken office barely a month earlier, in May 2003, retained the closed shop in the assembly bays and mobilised its membership. Workers staged protests outside the factory gates on Lee Road, the same gates through which Joseph Wright's men had walked to his funeral procession 144 years earlier. Petitions were collected in the streets around Washwood Heath Road and Alum Rock Road. The works convener and senior shop stewards lobbied local and national MPs. The Birmingham press covered the story for weeks. The Prime Minister himself called publicly for a positive outcome to talks between the government and Alstom. None of it saved a single job at Washwood Heath. The decision had been taken in Paris. The factories that would remain open were in France and Spain. The factory that would close was in Birmingham. And no amount of parliamentary motions, trade union protests, prime ministerial statements, or press coverage would alter the fundamental equation. Alstom was a French company, and French companies protected French jobs. Chapter 11. Mission accomplished. On April 29, 2004, Sir Richard Branson visited Washwood Heath to mark the start of production of the 53rd and final Pendolino, set 390053, named Mission Accomplished. It was a ceremony heavy with the particular cruelty of a job completed by a workforce that had already been told it was no longer needed. Branson, in the company press release issued the following day, told the assembled workers, "We are delighted with the quality of the Pendolino trains that are coming off the production line. I would congratulate the whole workforce at Washwood Heath on a tremendous achievement." Peter Doolin, manager of Alstom's West Coast mainline business at Washwood Heath, gave the statement that the workers and the local journalists would remember longest. "Today is a day of achievement and pride. Within the next few months, we will complete the delivery of the 53 Pendolino trains for Virgin Trains West Coast mainline, which is a tremendous achievement for the Alstom workforce. We are proud that we have produced a quality product, a fleet of state-of-the-art trains that will provide a lasting testimony to Alstom rail transport expertise." A lasting testimony. He was right about that, though not in the way he intended. The Pendolinos are still running. The workforce that built them is gone. There was no equivalent ceremony when the actual last train left the production line. No speeches, no press release, no visit from a billionaire. The work simply ended, and the bays fell quiet, and the men who had built 53 nine-car tilting trains, the most complex rolling stock ever assembled in Birmingham, collected their tools and walked out through the same gates their predecessors had walked through for 92 years. Some of them had been at the works for 20 years or more. Some had followed their fathers through those gates. The last shift ended the way last shifts always end, not with ceremony, but with routine. The familiar motions of clocking out and walking away carried out one final time in a place where those motions had been repeated millions of times before. By October 8, 2004, press photographers were already documenting the empty bays. The images that survive from that day, held now in the Getty and Alamy archives, show the assembly lines stretching to the high windowed roofs, the overhead crane rails still in place, the painted markings on the concrete floor where vehicles had been positioned for fitting out, and at intervals the steel rings set into the ground for the jacking points, where, weeks earlier, Pendolino body shells had been lifted onto their bogies. The scale of the emptiness was the point. These were not small rooms. These were cathedral-sized spaces, designed to hold multiple full-length railway vehicles simultaneously, and they were completely, utterly vacant. No trains, no workers, no sound except the wind through the broken roof panels and the pigeons that had already begun to colonize the upper steelwork. In mid-March 2005, the West Coast project formally moved off the site. Maintenance and renovation staff were transferred to the Alstom Power facility at Rugby. By the end of 2005, the Washwood Heath factory was completely vacated, every desk cleared, every tool removed, every trace of productive human activity stripped from the building. In late 2006, Alstom announced the sale of its remaining UK renovation business, including operations at Springburn in Glasgow, Wolverton near Milton Keynes, and engineering staff at Rugby, to Railcare Limited. The withdrawal from UK train manufacture was total. The company that had acquired Metro-Cammell in 1989 promising European scale and a global future, had exited the country entirely. It left behind an empty building and 1,400 redundancy notices. The final headcount loss is reported variously as 1,400 jobs, the figure used in the 2003 early day motion, and 1,900, cited by Birmingham local media for the cumulative redundancies, including maintenance and renovation staff, displaced through to 2006. Both numbers undercount the wider economic impact, the component suppliers, the subcontractors, the specialist engineering firms in the Midlands supply chain that had depended on Washwood Heath orders for decades. A factory does not exist in isolation. It sits at the centre of a web of smaller enterprises, electrical component suppliers, metal fabricators, upholstery firms, testing equipment companies, and when the anchor factory closes, that web unravels. The total employment impact across the supply chain has never been formally calculated. It was certainly larger than 1,900. In the constituency of Hodge Hill, Terry Davis had resigned as MP on the 22nd of June 2004 to become Secretary-General of the Council of Europe, triggering a by-election on July 15, 2004 that became one of the most bruising electoral contests of the Blair years. The Labour candidate, Liam Byrne, held the seat against Liberal Democrat Nicola Davies by just 460 votes, in a constituency that had been safe Labour for a generation. The closure of Washwood Heath, the loss of the LDV van factory on nearby Drews Lane, and the visible decay of East Birmingham's industrial base had turned a political certainty into a knife edge. Byrne would spend the next 2 decades fighting for the Washwood Heath site, placing figures on the Hansard record that measured the human cost in terms that parliamentary language rarely permits. By 2014, he told the Commons, Hodge Hill, Ladywood and Erdington, 3 of Birmingham's 10 constituencies, all containing or adjacent to former Metro-Cammell or LDV land, accounted for 45% of the city's total unemployed. £73.8 million was paid annually in unemployment benefits across those wards. The connection between factory closure and community collapse was not theoretical. It was measurable, in pounds and in lives, on the Hansard record. The workers themselves scattered across the Midlands engineering economy. Many found skilled employment at Jaguar Land Rover, whose plants at Solihull and Castle Bromwich were expanding through the 2000s and needed the precise metalworking skills that Washwood Heath men carried in their hands. Others transferred to Alstom's remaining UK sites, Wolverton near Milton Keynes or Rugby, where maintenance and renovation work continued under Alstom and later Railcare. Younger men retrained, some into the automotive sector, others into aerospace, a few into the construction trades that were booming in the Midlands through the mid-2000s. Older men, those in their mid-50s who had entered the works as apprentices in the 1960s and expected to serve out their final years at Washwood Heath, retiring with a handshake and a clock from the Beaufort Club, took early retirement and carried their skills into silence. There was no formal oral history programme, no university project to record what they knew, no documentary team at the time to capture the accumulated knowledge of 4 generations of train builders before it dispersed. The skills, the institutional memory of how to build a railway vehicle from first principle to final test, went with the men who possessed them, unrecorded, undocumented, and irreplaceable. Chapter 12. Ruins. In 2002, before the closure announcement, Alstom had already sold the Washwood Heath site to St Modwen Properties, leasing it back for the remaining Pendolino work. Through the late 2000s, the factory stood half derelict. Parts of the old Metro-Cammell sheds were repurposed as a pallet factory. Network Rail occupied a section. Alstom kept a residual maintenance presence. The adjoining LDV Group works on Drews Lane. The former Wolseley and British Leyland van factory, owned by Vickers from 1914 and trading as LDV from 1993, closed in 2009. 2 great Birmingham factories, side by side, both dark. In September and December 2018, urban explorers documented what remained of the Midland works. Their photographs, posted to forums and websites that specialise in the documentation of abandoned industrial sites, are the last visual record of the interior of the building that Joseph Wright's successors had erected in 1912. Vast skylit assembly bays, the glass panels in the roof now broken and letting in shafts of winter light that fell on the painted assembly line markings on the concrete floor below. Old enamel lampshades hanging from the roof trusses at intervals, The wiring long since cut, the faint outlines of overhead crane rails, their traversing wheels frozen in rust. Drawing office furniture left in place, desks, plan chests, filing cabinets, as though the draftsman had simply stood up one afternoon and walked out and never come back. Every 100 yards, the steel rings set into the floor for the jacking points, where 14 years earlier, Pendolino body shells had been lifted onto their bogies. An industrial cathedral, emptied of everything except its own architecture and the silence that had moved in to occupy the space the work had left behind. Demolition began in late February 2019. The steel-framed bays and the brick walls that had stood since 1912 came down in a matter of weeks. 107 years of continuous industrial presence reduced to rubble in less time than it took to build a single Pendolino. The Railway magazine reported that much of the material from the demolished buildings would be reused in the construction of the new depot, the bones of the old factory ground up and pressed into the foundations of its replacement. There is something in that detail that resists commentary. The building that built the trains became the substrate on which the trains would be serviced. In December 2016, the UK government had bought the 50-acre former Alstom plot from St Modwen Properties for an undisclosed sum. In 2018, a row of houses and a motor workshop on Common Lane were compulsorily purchased and demolished to enlarge the depot footprint. In February 2021, HS2 Limited issued tenders for an estimated £275 million depot construction contract. Planning permission was granted by Birmingham City Council in early 2023. The site is now under construction by a Balfour-Beatty-Vinci joint venture, a 40,000 square metre maintenance building, 14 sidings, a stabling yard, and the Network Integrated Control Centre that will oversee the entire HS2 network. Around 500 staff will eventually be employed, all of it sitting on land where Metro-Cammell once employed 4,500 people building the trains that carried a nation. The construction teams found what you would expect to find beneath a site that had been an engineering works for more than a century. Hydrocarbons in the soil, decades of machine oil and cutting fluid soaked into the ground. Asbestos in the soil, from insulation materials used in construction and vehicle building from the 1930s through the 1970s. And tunnels. Tim Cook, the HS2 project manager, described the discovery of structures, particularly underneath what was the Alstom factory, almost certainly the buried foundations of 19th century shop floors, utility runs, and quite possibly the concrete tank loading ramps from the Great War, the same ramps from which the Mark V tanks had been driven onto flatbed railway wagons for dispatch to the Western Front. The ground remembers what the surface has forgotten. Beneath the concrete of the HS2 depot lies a century of industrial history, compressed into soil and stone, invisible and indestructible. The final irony is geographically perfect. In May 2026, the United Kingdom does not possess an integrated train manufacturer of its own. The country that built the world's first intercity railway, that exported locomotives and carriages to every continent on Earth, that invented the only serious British rival to the Pendolino in the advanced passenger train, now imports virtually all of its rolling stock from foreign-owned factories on British soil. Hitachi Rail, a Japanese company, builds Class 800 and 801 Azuma trains at Newton Aycliffe in County Durham. A factory opened in 2015 on a former Ministry of Defence site. Alstom, the same Alstom that closed Washwood Heath, operates the former Bombardier works at Derby Litchurch Lane, acquired in 2021, where in June 2024 it signed a €430 million contract for 10 new Elizabeth Line trains, saving 1,300 jobs that had been at risk of the same fate as the Washwood Heath workforce. Siemens Mobility, a German company, is constructing a new factory at Goole in East Yorkshire to manufacture the replacement trains for the Piccadilly line, the line that currently runs on Metro-Cammell 1973 stock. CAF, a Spanish company, builds trains at Llanwern in South Wales. The Class 374 Eurostars are built by Siemens at Krefeld in Germany. The HS2 high-speed trains will be built by an Alstom-Hitachi joint venture, assembled at Newton Aycliffe and Crewe. So the Washwood Heath HS2 depot will receive and maintain Alstom-Hitachi trains, assembled in County Durham and Cheshire by French and Japanese companies, on the very land where Britain's greatest train builder once stood. The 1973 Piccadilly Line stock, the carriages that bear England Metro-Cammell 1973 in brass under every door, is being scrapped as these words are written. Its replacement will arrive from Goole, bearing the name Siemens. The most trodden manufacturer's plate in Britain will be removed, melted down, and replaced by a German one. Chapter 13. What remains? There is no plaque at Washwood Heath, no blue disc on a wall, no heritage board explaining what stood here for 107 years and what was built inside it. The corporate archive sits split between two locations. The Library of Birmingham holds the Metro-Cammell collection, approximately 100 photograph albums spanning the 1910s to the 1980s, 100,000 microfiche engineering drawings, specifications, minute books, and rolling stock plans. The Historical Model Railway Society at Butterley in Derbyshire holds the paper originals of many of those drawings, the general arrangement plans for the 1938 tube stock, the Blue Pullman, the Hong Kong M train, the Pendolino. On paper, in drawers, in a society archive in the Derbyshire countryside, the precise dimensions of everything that Washwood Heath ever built are still recorded. The knowledge survives. The capability to act on it does not. The name Metro-Cammell survives in one place. On the Piccadilly line, beneath the doors of the 1973 stock, the brass floor plates still read, England Metro-Cammell 1973. They have been there for more than 50 years, walked over by hundreds of millions of feet, polished smooth by the passage of commuters who never looked down. Those carriages are being withdrawn now, replaced by Siemens trains from Goole, and when the last one is scrapped, the last physical trace of the Metro-Cammell name in daily public use will be gone. What was built at Washwood Heath is not difficult to summarise. Nearly 100,000 vehicles in 25 years. The London Underground fleet that carried half of all tube journeys in the 1980s. The Blue Pullman, the Tyne and Wear Metro, 768 cars for the Hong Kong MTR, the Eurostar buffet cars, 53 Pendolinos that still run the West Coast Main Line, the Mark V tanks that broke the Hindenburg Line, the Valentines that crossed the Western Desert. If you have ever taken the tube, caught the Eurostar, ridden a Pendolino to Glasgow, commuted on the Tyne and Wear Metro, or flown into Hong Kong, you have sat in something that was built behind those brick walls, by those men, in that place. What happened to it is not complicated either. A British company was sold to a Franco-British joint venture in 1989 by a man who believed he was giving it a future. The man who kept the joint venture balanced retired in 1996 and was replaced by a man who wanted out of manufacturing altogether. The joint venture became a French corporation in 1998. The French corporation closed the British factory in 2003 while holding British public contracts that it built in Spain, and while being rescued by a French government bailout that treated it as a national strategic asset, the same status it denied to its British operations. The decision was taken in Paris. The consequences were felt in Birmingham. The community that had built its life around the works was left with nothing except the silence that moved in when the work moved out. The building was demolished in 2019. The land is now a maintenance depot for trains designed in France and Japan. 500 people will work there eventually, servicing rolling stock that arrives from elsewhere. It is not nothing, but it is not what was there before, and the difference between building something and maintaining something built by someone else is the difference between having a skill and having a job. Britain spent 160 years building the trains the world copied. Then, it sold the company that built them to a partner that was supposed to give it European scale. The partner became a competitor. The competitor closed the factory, and the country that invented the railway found itself standing in the ruins of its last great train builder, buying its rolling stock from the French, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Spanish, on land where its own workers once built the wagons of empire. The works hooter at Washwood Heath sounded for the last time sometime in 2004 or 2005. Nobody recorded the exact date. Nobody thought to. It was just a sound that stopped. One of those absences that you only notice after the fact, when the silence has had time to settle into the shape of the building that used to make it, and you realise that what you're hearing is not quiet, it's the sound of something that should be there and isn't.